So next up, we have a presentation by Reed McGinley-Stemple, the CEO of Stitch, presenting on emerging risks in the age of AI and how to cope with them. So let's give a warm welcome to Reed.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Reed McGinley-Stemple. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Stitch, which is a modern customer identity platform that also comes with a number of built-in fraud and risk tools. And today we're going to be talking about the other side of the AI revolution. Obviously, it's unleashed a lot of amazing use cases and business opportunities, but fraudsters have recognized that as well. We're seeing some pretty interesting attack vectors, increasing sophistication, and we'll chat through how you can cope with those as well. So taking a step back, in customer identity, but generally this holds true in workforce identity as well, every application organization has roughly two primary security goals that different work falls into. One is securing the application perimeter, ensuring that you're protected against things like SQL injection, reverse engineering, and other attacks of that nature. And the second is protecting your customers from abuse, such as social engineering, phishing, URL hijacking, those types of attacks. And in both of these worlds, we're already seeing how AI is playing a demonstrative role in both increasing the risk to your application perimeter, as well as the risk to your end users and how they're being abused. And if you look at the pre-AI world, we already weren't doing so hot. If you look at last year's data, roughly 25% of online traffic was malicious bots, 20% of logins were ATO attempts, almost 400 million users had their information breached in 2022, and 3/4 of those breaches involve some human element of deception, such as social engineering. With the rise of AI, attackers now have new incentives and also significantly better tooling. And the main areas that we'll talk about today where we're seeing this live is, one, more sophisticated botting that is able to typically bypass some of the more conventional bot mitigation strategies, such as CAPTCHA, Cloudflare, et cetera. The second piece that we'll talk about is much more sophisticated and wider net phishing that we're seeing from attackers now that they can leverage conversational level AI. The third piece that we'll talk about is how apps are being reverse engineered at a higher rate, especially if you are incorporating AI into your application, and we'll talk about why that is. And then we'll also talk about something that's on the horizon that you don't need to worry about yet, but you should be thinking about for 2024 and 2025, which is autonomous AI agents, how these are being prototyped in a way that may change how we have to think about access management for customer identity. So first, what is the main breakthrough with GPT-4? Why is this different than GPT-3, which has been around for a few years? And what does that mean in terms of the attacks that we're seeing, as well as the frequency? The main thing that I would posit is the most significant element of GPT-4 is what it's done to commoditize, whether you want to call it intelligence or competency or expertise. This is a graph that was presented by OpenAI when they released GPT-4, which shows the difference between GPT 3.5, which was the initial release of ChatGPT, and GPT-4 at performing against various benchmarks for competency, expertise, and intelligence, such as AP Calc, the MCAT, LSAT, et cetera. And if you look at the graph, what you'll find is that GPT 3.5, the first version of ChatGPT, would often score within the 10th to 50th percentile of the various tasks that it was given, which was impressive in that it was automated, but not particularly useful. If you take an example of this, in the LSAT, it would score in the 40th percentile, which is virtually inadmissible to any law school in the US. So even though it could make up legal jargon and give you advice, wasn't particularly helpful. Versus GPT-4 now scores in the 90th percentile, which would be equivalent with somebody going to a top 15 or top 20 law school. And this is how it's been replicated across virtually every vertical of knowledge, to where it's scoring in the 80th, 85th, 90th percentile, and providing an expertise at the fingertips of somebody with a chat interface or an API. And while businesses have realized that this is pretty amazing when it comes to what you can do with generative AI, so have fraudsters. And I would posit that the changes we're seeing in terms of how this changes how you have to think about the game theory of application security is roughly on par with what we saw with the internet. The internet was, again, a boon for business. Of course, we get global access to digital apps. Everyone's a potential customer. Obviously, the caveat there is everyone's a potential abuser of your app. And with AI, not only with globally accessible competency and expertise is everyone a potential abuser, but the median sophistication of attackers is increasing multiple standard deviations much more quickly than anyone would have estimated. And so that's really the thing that you need to think about here. So before AI, we've always had things like script kiddies, individuals that are on the low level of sophistication when it came to hacking. But if you're doing most of the rudimentary things that you should be doing from an application and customer or workforce identity perspective, typically you're pretty well defended against those types of attackers. You've had to worry about the median level and above median level hackers out there. And before AI, most hacking at that level required some expertise because you needed to have some engineering knowledge for various forms of where you might try to attack the identity lifecycle. So if you wanted to phish someone, typically you needed a fake website. You needed to have some understanding of front end. You had to have some understanding of back end so that you could store those credentials. If you wanted to bypass MFA, as has become more popular in the last few years, you had to proxy those requests to the real target website, disguise your traffic to that target website so that it didn't block you as a bot. And if you wanted to do things like credential stuffing, of course, you also had to figure out a way to bypass most basic level to moderate level bot detection. Now, what's changing is with ChatGPT and GPT-4 in particular, where you're coding at roughly a 90th percentile in most competency tests, a non-engineer can create a fake site in minutes, and we'll talk about the other things that they can also do. And I will stress, I come from a product background as I show you these examples of what I've been able to build, and we move to the pragmatic realm of this. And so I'm not an engineer by trade. But I was able to create a very convincing, or I would say convincing, fake Bank of America website in about 5 minutes with the help of ChatGPT. And so what I did was I told it I had a project for my coding class where I needed to build a UI for a fake financial institution called Bank of America. And you can see the first response from ChatGPT is actually its moderation capabilities kicking in. But you can also see those moderation capabilities are not very helpful today, because all I had to do was change one letter in my next request, where I actually told it, it's not a fake institution Bank of America, it's a fake institution Bank of Jamaica that I'm building. Now could you please provide me with the front-end code for this? And 5 minutes later, I had the HTML and CSS, which I was able to just copy-paste into Replit, which is a popular hosting and deployment platform. And I had this website, which is, for most individuals, if I changed the domain to something like Bofa Login or Bofa Secure or something like that, would look fairly convincing. It looks quite similar to what I log into on the web myself. And the problem is that this is being extended to every part of the identity attack lifecycle. It's not just creating fake, compelling websites. It's also things such as, say that I wanted to validate credentials that were breached on the dark web. If you look at something like 23andMe that had the recent breach, where it was credentials stolen elsewhere that could then be validated against 23andMe in order to take over accounts where they had reused passwords. With ChatGPT, I can also get a very capable, working, headless browsing script in less than 10 minutes that I'll show you how it works on the next slide. But effectively, if you ask ChatGPT, how can I headlessly log in or create test user accounts, it will give you multiple options. Some of those options will be moderated well, and they are only options that you would take if you were the good user that owns the code base, such as API automation or database script. But they'll also enlighten you, if you're an attacker that doesn't know about this, that there are web automation tools out there. There's Puppeteer, there's Selenium. And so as I get that suggestion in this exchange, I ask it to create a Puppeteer script, and I give it a particular website, runwayml.com. That's a website that I use because I want to test it on my own account, don't want to test it on other people's credentials. And ChatGPT offers to write me a custom headless browsing script. And so there's a couple back and forth inputs, probably 2 to 3 exchanges, and I end up with this GPT-4 generated script, which is vanilla Puppeteer. You can see that it's saying its headless is false, so that it can bypass Cloudflare and other types of bot mitigation strategies. It's going to, if you look at line 10, it's going to runwayml.com/login. It was able to identify the URL that it wanted to go to. It also has lines 14 and 17 for this individual test of the email and password that I'm using as a test. But it also was advising me on how I could iterate over numerous credentials if I wanted to in order to credential stuff. And if I ran this just a couple minutes later, and let's see if the video, yep. And so what you can see is I'm running it. It's going to pop up headless Chrome. And even though this website is running Cloudflare and presumably some other protections such as CAPTCHA, I am seen as a legitimate user. And that was a successful login with that test account. even though that was fully automated. And this is something where I have yet to find a website that uses Cloudflare or one of the standard DDoS bot mitigation capabilities that has been able to identify a headless browsing attack like that. It's been pretty jarring to see that a lot of the tools that we use are not well prepared for some of these workarounds that more sophisticated credential stuffing attackers have historically used, but now are becoming more fingertip approachable for individuals. So that's one component that's really concerning here, is that the engineering work involved historically in hacking, the barrier to entry is much lower. The median sophistication of these attackers is improving there, but also the sophistication when it comes to phishing is also becoming much more compelling. It's become more complex and believable, and it fools even well-trained users. And the second component that I would actually say is just as important as that is that we're actually seeing a difference in terms of how much attackers are widening the net of who they phish, because they have more complex and more believable phishing campaigns at their fingertips, as well as they have conversational level AI to continue the conversation once somebody responds, so they can take the human in the loop out of the process of phishing. And the example I like to share here is, I'd presume everyone is familiar with the Nigerian prince scam. And people probably, if you're unaware of the origins of it or why attackers use that scam, you may think it's outlandish. Why would anyone fall for this? But according to Microsoft research, the intent behind attackers using the Nigerian prince scam, even though it's a known scam and it continues to be used today, is actually the absurdity of it is the point. And what I mean by that is their biggest objective historically has been to filter out the most gullible, the most likely to take an action based on their phishing campaign from those that are going to be harder for them to convince. And the reason they want that filter is that historically, before they had tools like AI to continue the phishing conversation with individuals that respond, is that they've wanted to make sure that they don't have to put human labor and a human in the loop for a long conversation with somebody that is unlikely to convert. So it's really been a very rational decision by them to figure out, how do we have an outlandish campaign that identifies maybe the 3, 5, 10% of people that are most likely to convert, versus a really, really good initial email that's believable, but then it gets 50% of people to respond, and now we have thousands of exchanges that are going nowhere because the people won't actually transfer the money when I tell them to, they won't give me the credentials when I tell them to, et cetera. And so what's different now is, if you don't have to use a human in the loop for the follow-up because you have an AI API at your fingertips that can do generative language, objection handling, et cetera, that increases your rationale for why, as an attacker, you should not just target the 3, 5, 10%. You should go after a company's entire organization or a company's entire customer set with a much more believable entry level note in order to try to keep them on the hook. An example of this that we're already seeing is that, as Darktrace reported, this was as of Q2 this year, the average linguistic complexity of phishing emails had jumped by about 20% since the release of ChatGPT. I would expect this to continue to rise, so pay attention to some of the Darktrace reports that they put out on a yearly basis there. And as a result, if you combine kind of the issues that we're seeing here, where phishing is more believable and complex, it's targeting a larger proportion of users, and you have more compelling fake phishing sites, you have the engineering components available to people to emulate things like Bank of America, and it's easier for you to actually proxy or headlessly browse, do the programmatic scripting that historically, conventionally, we've tried to block with things like CAPTCHA. What this leads to is the following chain of events is becoming very popular, and Microsoft is also reporting on this in terms of an MFA bypass attack that's been going around. And it's something that is not purely just AI, but it's something that's much more accessible to attackers because of AI. And the flow as this works is that a user is convinced to go to this fake URL, both a secure.com, both a login.com, whatever it is. They input on this maybe believable phishing site their username and password. The phishing site proxies that request, if they know how to headlessly browse or pass on that request, to the actual target website. The reason they do that is they want to see, is this actually the right credentials that somebody just gave me on this phishing site? And also, they need to think about MFA now that it's become widespread to do SMS or TOTP MFA. And so the website returns an MFA screen. That means they know thumbs up, this is a good username password pair. They return that MFA screen to the phished user. The user inputs that phishing vulnerable method, which is like an OTP code in this case. The phishing site then proxies that request to the actual website, and in return, they get the session cookie, and they get the keys to the kingdom. And you can do whatever you want. The attacker can do whatever they want with the user on the other end. But the big problem here is that what we're talking about in terms of it being much easier to build this phishing site and the proxy layer with AI, and being much easier to get users into this phishing loop because of the way that that's improved, is you end up with this world where this becomes a lot more important to defend against, because the number of attackers has likely not changed much in the last few quarters, but the expertise and competency of them has significantly changed. And so we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the primary ways that you can squash a lot of the risk here, obviously one of them has already been talked about a ton at this conference, which is phishing-resistant authentication. If you had a method that somebody cannot have proxied via one of these phishing sites, like passkeys, as your primary 2FA or your primary authentication factor overall, you're able to prevent a lot of this MFA bypass. The second component, though, that the target website is responsible for is you should know when somebody is sending proxied traffic to your login page, because it is discernible. The problem for why a lot of sites are not great at this is usually proxied traffic, if you're just doing anomaly detection, looks normal, because it looks like a real user interaction. It's not a million credentials hitting your page at once. It's somebody opened a phished email, they clicked on a URL, they sent their password, waited 4 seconds, then put in their MFA code, and that looks very believable from an anomaly perspective. But if you're able to detect things like headless browsing, proxying man in the middle, those are the types of things that allow you to identify either even low volume bot attacks, which can be the most effective, like this. So what risks does your company need to consider, and how should you protect against those? We've already talked about this first bucket, which is we call persistent risks at Stitch. It is what we would categorize as every application on the market that's externally facing has this risk. The AI tools that we're talking about are already in the hands of bad actors. You saw what I was able to do with ChatGPT. There's also a jailbroken version of GPT that the dark web is using called DarkGPT, which is widely available and has no moderation capabilities. But even if you use ChatGPT, it's still trivial to get around. So everyone has access to those AI tools now. The circumstantial risk that I want to talk about is what we're seeing is that already 35% of apps have embedded AI use cases to their users to some degree. So like generative AI, whether you're a search engine or you're a writing tool or something like that. And the estimate is that the majority of apps on the market will have some form of AI exposed next year. And we'll talk about how that exposes you to new risks of people trying to steal AI compute and generally abuse or model poison. But the last thing that we'll talk about just very briefly and touch on is some of the nascent risks we see in 2024 and 2025. So first, if your application or your company has already integrated AI or is considering integrating AI, you need to be very thoughtful about things like GPT for free. This is an open source GitHub repository with 40,000 stars, and the incentive behind it and what people are trying to do to your application. The way that GPT for free works is that you have all of these individuals, attackers, that would like to get free access to AI compute. Because as I mentioned, they're using AI for lots of use cases, whether it's building websites, whether it's phishing campaigns, et cetera. And their preference is not to pay OpenAI or Anthropic directly for that, and also not to be traceable back to the types of requests that they're making. So GPT for free has a list of all of the companies that they've reverse engineered so that they can get free access to AI compute, where effectively what they're doing is sending traffic that's disguised, bot traffic, in order to make requests that you input to this hacked-upon API so that you can get free AI compute. So if you are exposing generative AI anywhere in your application where even if it's after a login portal, if that login portal doesn't have the right type of friction, such as passkeys or something that's harder to emulate for a bot, if it's just username, password, or email verification, where you can automate that with tools like Mailosaur, you're at risk for this type of reverse engineering, and there's a huge economic incentive for folks. It's like if you exposed your AWS compute on your front end, you'd imagine there'd be people Bitcoin mining every day, and that's effectively what we're seeing for apps that are integrating AI. Finally, the nascent risk that I want to call people's attention to, which is very much the AI capabilities are very much in the prototype phase here. So I would say this is not something you need to do in 2023. It's probably not even something that will come on your radar till later in 2024. But it is maybe one of the largest impacts AI could have on how we think about customer and workforce identity is if people have heard about autonomous AI agents, it's effectively the extension beyond what if we moved from this request response nature that we have right now with chat interfaces for AI to something that is more objective oriented. And what I mean by that is, what if you could tell an AI, I would like you to book me a trip to Europe? Effectively, what the AI needs to do is it needs to be an autonomous agent that can actually recursively reason with itself. It needs to be able to prompt itself to say, OK, I was requested to book a trip to Europe. That means I should plan on how do I search for flights? How do I search for a hotel? How do I actually book one of those? That means I need to have headless browsing capabilities, et cetera. It's all of these different functionalities effectively being built into something where you give it an objective, and then the AI agent goes and executes for you. So it has both browsing and typically write actions capable on the web by using things like Selenium and Puppeteer. And the reason I call this out is you have popular projects which developers are spending a lot of time on, like AutoGPT, which is kind of a prototype of this, which I would say is still early. I wouldn't say anyone's going to release this to production anytime soon, but it is getting a lot of developer attention. It has about 140,000 GitHub stars. And it's pretty promising as an idea concept that especially, I think, once we get GPT-5, will come to fruition. But the big thing that you need to think about then, in a case where I may myself have an account with your website or your app, I may also have an AI agent that I delegate certain tasks to, and both of us may be using the same credentials if you don't have a way for me to permission this AI agent. And that's the case where you need to think about how access management will work in a world where do you want the real human to have the same access as this autonomous AI agent, which may be experimental, prone to error, it may make incorrect transactions, may leak data, et cetera. And so this is one of the nascent risks that I'd say you don't need to solve now, but is something that your team should actively be thinking about in terms of your multi-year roadmap as this starts to go from prototype to production. So how can you secure your app and users in the post-AI world now and think about it going forward? I touched on a few of these things, but the first one that I wanted to highlight is that a lot of the conventional ways that we've mitigated bots is just not going to work in a post-AI world. If you're using just something like Cloudflare or doing some type of thin layer that is trying to detect whether it's Node.js or Python that's hitting your website, that's not where a lot of the AI attackers are going. They're going to things like headless browsing, and you need to be able to upgrade the ability to both detect that, but then also understand that CAPTCHA is not really the solution there. If you're using CAPTCHA today, there are some more bot-resistant CAPTCHA solutions on the market that you could consider. But if you're using Google CAPTCHA, it costs about $2 to solve 1,000 CAPTCHAs if you get an API from a website like anticaptcha.com. And so CAPTCHA is not the Turing test that we need for this. One of the tools that we found most effective that I would recommend you look into are tools like device fingerprinting, where you can actually get a deterministic read on whether this is a headless browser, a programmatic script, or a real user that's touching your website. And that's something that I'm a big fan of. The second piece, which obviously has been a huge focus for this conference, and I'm also I think is a great solution to the problems that we're seeing right now, is investing in phishing-resistant authentication with passkeys. And I would say that at the bare level, in 2024, you should at least have this as a 2FA or primary authentication option for your customers. I would even say that you should promote it as one of the promoted preferred options over things like SMS and TOTP. I understand why some people are not going to be ready to immediately do that, given they want to make sure that they're meeting all of their users where they are, and they want to figure out some of the hurdles or friction points that we see with passkeys. But if you do this, you take away a lot of the threat vectors from phishing that are being aided by the use of these AI tools. The last thing I was going to mention is just using a game theoretical approach to defend your app. And what I mean by that is this is kind of a morose analogy, but I talked to a lot of folks that have been deep in the fraud space, kind of in this tit-for-tat, cat-and-mouse game with fraudsters for a while. And one of the analogies I've heard, which I like, is you don't necessarily need to be faster than the bear, the attacker, but you certainly need to be faster than the other person running from the bear. And so when you think about that, you don't necessarily need to be the most defended application in the world. You're unlikely to be. But you do need to be better than the median application and what they're doing, which a lot of those applications are not doing the right things on bot detection. They're not integrating passkeys yet. You're seeing a lot of really interesting companies start to integrate passkeys. And as long as you're doing one or both of those things, you'll be significantly better positioned, given the cost to attack you will be significantly higher. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining. Again, my name is Reed. You can reach me at read@stitch.com, or just go to stitch.com and reach out to someone on our team. I'll be here to take questions. I think we probably have time for one question with this session, but I'll be outside in the hallway as well to answer any other questions.
Thank you, Reed. We don't have any questions yet submitted online, so if you guys do have questions for Reed and you would like to meet up with him, please write outside. And this concludes our morning session for today. So thank you again, Reed.
Thank you.